This radar analysis is part of the NTSB report. It's buried at page 321 of the report, but it's one of the most basic and important pieces of the evidence in any investigation. Any newshound who wanted to could have gotten a look at it. This line shows the tail end of the plane's very gradual descent from 5,500 to 2,200 feet. Kennedy had not yet contacted the tower at this point, and FAA regulations require that you contact the tower before descending below 2,500 feet. So, being the meticulous pilot that he was, John brought the plane back up to 2,500 feet and contacted the tower. We don't know how long that conversation lasted, but if it lasted 1 minute, as soon as it was over, the plane began a catastrophic plunge into the sea. The conclusion seems obvious, doesn't it? It doesn't seem to matter what view you look at, south to north or east to west. It does not appear to be an accidental crash. It certainly looks as though someone on that plane decided to commit suicide the fun way, with a bunch of other people. There's no spiral to be detected in these depictions of the radar evidence. There's no disorienting movement of the plane of any kind. No one was able to find any evidence in the wreckage of an explosion, fire, or other catastrophe. It appears then as though someone grabbed the controls of the plane and pushed them violently forward. How could the NTSB have missed this? How is it not worth mentioning as a possibility? How did the sharks in the media not go nuts over this blood-red evidence of more Kennedy self-destruction? I don't know, but those aren't really the questions I'm trying to answer here. You see, I'm still hung up on that freaking fuel valve. I mean, let's say John decided for no apparent reason to kill himself, his wife, and his sister-in-law in his mother's front yard. That's right, isn't that sweet? The plane crashed just offshore of Jackie Kennedy's house on Martha's Vineyard, where John and his mother and sister spent many happy summer days. Some of the debris from the crash actually washed up on the beach in front of her house. So let's say that he decided to do that. And he decided to do it on the day before his cousin Rory's wedding, just to ruin the memory of her wedding in everyone's mind forever, so that they could remember the occasion the way he remembered his 3rd birthday as one of the saddest days of their lives. Okay, let's just accept the obvious for the sake of simplicity, that someone on that plane decided to commit suicide in the most monumentally ugly and hurtful way anyone possibly could think of. But the thing that's still bugging me is that John, or whoever committed murder-suicide, paused to carefully and deliberately turn the fuel valve off. Just in case the engine were to catch fire on the way down. This is still a freaking nutty explanation. Can't we come up with something that makes a little sense? But there it is. What you going to do? Ignore it? Deny it? Lie about it? Well, that's been done pretty well up till now, and we didn't come all this way just to close our eyes to the stuff we found. We came to see what we could see. So let's keep looking, right? I mean, what else? Keep looking, keep asking those questions. So I opened the yellow pages again and started calling up flight instructors again, talking to the ones who felt like talking about pilots who crash, talking about fuel selector valves, and pilots who turn their fuel selector valves to off as they are casually committing murder-suicide by plunging their planes, full of people, into the sea. It seems that it happens more often than you might imagine. You see, I was talking to this one old boy about John Kennedy's fuel valve, and he says,
"Yeah, that's mighty strange, all right, but strange things'll happen sometimes, you know. But hey now, I know another strange fuel valve story. You know that guy in Egypt Air 990? He turned off the fuel selector valve."
And I said, "What?" And he said,
"Yeah. You know, there was that flight out of New York City, Egypt Air 990, 15 weeks after John Junior's crash. There was a plane full of Egyptian military people, and right after takeoff, one of the pilots walks into the cockpit and says something about Allah Akbar, and bang, he grabbed the controls, the yoke, the steering thingy, and he pushed it all the way forward, sending the plane plunging straight down towards the ocean. Well, there's about 5 other pilots standing around, and they all jumped on this one maniac and pulled him away from the controls. And then they started struggling, pulling back on the steering yoke, trying to pull the plane out of the dive. But the plane had gathered speed and momentum, and a big airliner doesn't want to turn very easily under the best of circumstances, and so these guys are really struggling. And so while all the pilots are occupied with trying to bring the plane out of its dive, the maniac simply turns around and pushes the idiot button and turns the plane's fuel valves to off, instantly killing the engines. Now, without engine power, a 757 is a hulking dead weight, and the plane simply continued its natural course, plunging into the sea, killing 217 people.
Damn. Well, thank you, Professor. That's a hell of a story. And folks, that's just the beginning. Egypt Air 990 hit the water 50 miles from where John Kennedy Jr.'s plane went down. Now there's a coincidence for you. And I should probably mention, no one in Egypt buys this story. First, outside of military operations, Muslims don't commit suicide. It's just not part of their culture. Secondly, the family insists that he had nothing to be suicidal about. His family loved him, his career was solid, his life was good. So many Egyptians think that it's more likely that the plane was taken out by an Israeli missile in order to kill all the military people on board. But the black boxes were recovered, which not only recorded the sounds of the pilots' voices and the sounds of the struggle, but a second black box recorded the readings from all the gauges and the movements of any levers and instruments used by the pilots to control the plane, including the steering wheel thingy, the steering yoke, and the fuel selector valve. Well, there's a third explanation. See if you like it any better. According to this theory of what happened, the maniac pilot on Egypt Air 990 was a Manchurian candidate. He'd been hypnotized, programmed, brainwashed by some country's intelligence agency to kill himself and everyone else on that plane by pushing the controls forward. But most importantly for our investigation, this theory says he had also been programmed to then turn the fuel selector valve to off. He had been programmed to do it 3 months after someone on John Kennedy's plane did exactly the same thing. What do you mean programmed? Hollywood has made 2 movies in the last 40 years with the title The Manchurian Candidate. Both movies tell the story of individuals who have been programmed through mind control techniques to murder political figures. The films are not based on fantasy. You can scarcely imagine how delicate and easily manipulated the human mind is. The next time a hypnotist entertainer is in town, take in the show. This fuel valve business made me want to know more about hypnotism, so I went to see this guy, Mark Sweet. You would not believe it if you hadn't seen it. Only a handful of the people who volunteered and got up on the stage actually went under and were hypnotized, but those who were would believe anything this guy said and therefore do anything this guy asked. Here he tells 2 of them that their butts are glued to the seat and they can only free themselves by wagging their tongues around in the air. Believe me, if that bench had had an airline steering yoke attached to it and Mark told them to push it violently forward and then turn off the fuel control valves, they would have done it. After the show we talked to them and their families. This was not a setup. But don't take my word for it. Go yourself. The CIA has been studying the potential of hypnotism to fulfill their requirements for mind control for 40 years. They would like you to believe that in 40 years they've learned nothing. Of course they're lying, but how much is there to study? Using hypnosis, Mark can make a person do anything. The only difficulty then is that not everyone is easily hypnotized. You can bet then that the CIA spent the last 40 years messing with people's minds, trying to figure out how to hypnotize anybody they want. This guy was just fooling around. The CIA, however, was not. The CIA has conducted mind control experiments under the title MK Ultra for 50 years, many of them at this Canadian hospital. Here, the CIA's fascist scientist, Dr. Gottlieb, used all kinds of fancy techniques in his experiments.
They would use intensive electroshock and LSD and other disorienting drugs to, in his terms, de-pattern individuals, basically to wipe the slate clean. Second, using tape-recorded messages, try to program in new behaviors by repeating these messages hundreds of thousands of times, while the victim was immobilized with other drugs. And the final phase was to try to wipe the slate clean so that people could not, again, remember what had happened to them but still have the new behavior.
All without getting permission from anyone.
Now, it doesn't take long to figure out why the CIA or other intelligence agencies would be interested in such research.
Indeed.